Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 1990 drama comedy, The Bonfire of the Vanities. Now, The Bonfire of the Vanities is a film that is arguably more famous for its disastrous behind the scenes and backstory than it is for anything else. Like, this is a movie that, yeah, people are aware of it because of the fact that it was a high profile bomb. It was hyped up quite a bit before its release. A lot of studio heads at the time at Warner Brothers actually thought that this was going to be one of their biggest films ever. And it turned out to be one of their biggest films ever in one capacity. It turned out to be one of their biggest flops financially and critically of the 1990s. So they weren't that far off. But it's not one of those bad movies, though, that is entertaining or enjoyable. It's mostly boring and just your typical below average misfire. It's a film that had potential, and it ultimately didn't live up to its full potential at all. It's one of those movies that has some genuine golden crumbs. The film actually had the perfect analogy in a line of dialogue for the film itself in terms of the quality of the movie. The Bonfire of the Vanities is like a giant, massive golden cake with all the most elegant frosting and ingredients, but it all doesn't come together in the end to good results. All that you're left with is golden crumbs. Everything else is just full of air or just doesn't taste very good. The film is directed by Brian De Palma, and prior to his involvement with this film, the initial director attached to this project was Mike Nichols. And that makes a lot of sense. This seems like something that fits his style a lot more than Brian De Palma. And I think this film could have been better just due to that fact if you had Mike Nichols still involved with the film instead of Brian De Palma. Brian De Palma is not the guy that you hire to do a drama comedy. He's the guy that you hire to do a thriller or a horror film. Brian De Palma is not that kind of guy. He doesn't have that in his DNA. And it shows. It's just a really poor fit. And there are a lot of instances where this film is like somebody wearing a suit that's just 2 sizes too big, because you have a director who doesn't fit for the project, you have cast members that don't fit for the film as well. You have a score that doesn't fit the tone of the movie. There's just all these different things to just make it into an ill-fitting suit of a motion picture. And it starts at the top of Brian De Palma. I'm not going to say that Brian De Palma's direction in this was bad. It's not bad. It's just not right for this movie. There were a lot of scenes where it's very weird and just off-putting. And it's the kind of stuff that would work in a thriller or something that has horror elements. Like, there's a whole shot where you have a bunch of characters and they're standing around this box that has like it's not really an answering machine, but it's like some speaker box where their boss talks to them through the speaker. And so they're standing around this speaker box, and the camera is peering down at them from above, and it almost looks like it's also being shot with a fisheye lens. And it's just a really unsettling, weird shot, and it doesn't fit for that scene at all. It's just a bunch of people looking over and listening to some guy talking on a speaker. And there are a lot of other scenes like that where it just doesn't fit with the plot or with the overall tone of the movie. And when it comes to scenes that are supposed to be funny, it really doesn't land. And that's because Brian De Palma's not really the guy who's known for doing comedy either. That's like having a really well-known, high-profile horror director. Like, for example, it's like having Rob Zombie direct a drama comedy. You'd be like, eh. Or having James Wan do something like that. It's not a good fit. Brian De Palma's not a bad director, and there are some scenes in this that are well shot and have a certain style to them and really do pop, but most of the time the direction just sags a little. It's nothing really that special. It kind of seems like Brian's kind of going through the motions. It's kind of flat. But then there's other times where he's just trying to go gonzo and wild with it, and it just doesn't fit. It just does not work. It's an ingredient that just doesn't mix well with this golden cake. And then the screenplay by Michael Christopher. I mean, this screenplay, honestly, flat out sucks. If you want to talk about the worst thing about this movie, other than a couple of the film's performances, it's the screenplay. I mean, I have an incredibly hard time believing that they were unable to find another writer or have somebody come in and do some rewrites. Because prior to this, the only thing that this guy did in terms of writing a film that did any sort of business in the box office or was at all beloved by critics was The Witches of Eastwick. And I really like that film. And ultimately, I would say he did a much better job writing that than The Bonfire of the Vanities. This script makes the mistake of trying to turn the character of Sherman McCoy into a sympathetic figure. In the novel, which I haven't read, by the way, but I am aware of its approach and I am aware of what it was trying to do. And in the novel, Sherman McCoy is not a sympathetic figure. He's a cynical prick. And the whole novel is very cynical. It's very dark. And first off, a big budget Hollywood film by a major studio is not the right fit for something like that. I mean, you're expecting Hollywood at this time, who is in the throes of excess. You're expecting them to be cynical towards themselves. Not the right time to do an adaptation of that. And if that isn't bad enough, then you have this writer come in and just change the whole feel and the whole vibe of the film and just make it into this very wishy-washy, just fractured kind of story. And it really sucks the life out of the movie. Yeah, the film could have been a slog either way, but if it just had a more consistent tone, if it was cynical, if it was dark, if it was just really wry, then maybe that might work. If it was cynical, dark, wry, and had a lot of sly humor and satire, that really might have been something genuinely good. But this half-assed, wishy-washy bullshit where it wants to be cynical about racism and about all these other social issues, but then wants to be sympathetic and wants to kind of try to tug at your heartstrings a little with the father-son dynamic and some of this other stuff, and wants to make you root for Sherman McCoy and wants you to really pull for him to find a way to get out of his predicament. It's just something that is completely and totally ineffective from a storytelling standpoint. Because from the moment you were introduced to this character, you don't like this guy. He's cheating on his wife. He's taking his dog out for a walk in the rain when the dog clearly doesn't want to go. I mean, like, dude, that just what? Just right from the beginning, you're like, this guy is a dick. I don't give a shit. I don't care. And then when you find out that he gets involved in this situation where there's this African American teen who it seems like he's trying to mug him, and his it's not fiance because he's already married, but his mistress. So it seems like he's trying to mug him and his mistress, and then the film tries to do this nonsense where it's like, oh, he was innocent, and he was an honor student, and he was this and that, and he should have never been mowed down in the prime of his life. He was just there on the street. I just don't understand why the script was just so muddled when it comes to a lot of key points and key aspects of this story. It just felt like at this point in the film, it's trying to insinuate that there really wasn't anything wrong that happened here. Tom Hanks, his character, Sherman, and his mistress, they just acted in self-defense to get away from these muggers. And then the film tries to make it into this big deal. And I think the point is that it's made into this big deal because of race and because of power dynamics in New York City and classism and all this other stuff. But it's just so poorly handled and poorly written that it just becomes a mess. And it doesn't help either that by the end of the film, it doesn't really feel like any of it kind of really mattered in the first place. But it's just one of those things where, okay, they're trying to set this thing up where Sherman got involved in a hit and run, and the would-be mayor, the current DA, he wants to be mayor, and so he needs to bust some white guy so he can get the black voters on his side, and it's got to be some rich, privileged white guy, and here's his white whale in Sherman McCoy. So then he starts doing whatever he can to pin the crime on him, even though it was his mistress that was driving the car that hit the guy in the first place. And then there's this stuff with a preacher who's trying to do a hustle where he can start making money off of this whole thing that involves a lawsuit towards the hospital because the teenager wasn't even... He was killed. He was put in a coma, apparently. He was put into a coma, and the whole plan is that the preacher is going to use this whole story so he could sue the hospital, so he can make a lot of money. And of course you have the stuff going on with the mistress who has her own gains that she's trying to follow. For one, it's freedom, so she screws over Sherman, and then it's up to Sherman to pretty much clear his name. And there's also this connection with Peter Fallow, this journalist who was disgraced and was a drunk and was considered a total loser and totally inept, but then he falls into this story with Sherman McCoy, and then he turns it into this best-selling novel. And there are moments where Sherman and Peter actually share screen time with one another. And it's just one of those things where there are all these different things going on, all these different subplots, all this different stuff. There's this thing with this assistant DA who's trying to make a name for himself. There's this stuff with a judge who is just trying to get people to be decent to one another and is tired of all this bullshit. And it all culminates in just a very bland finale. It's a big speech by the judge, and the sentiment isn't bad, but it just comes across as not necessarily insincere, but a little bit too over the top to really feel like it's a genuine kind of statement. And I guess originally the ending was going to involve some nonsense where Sherman gets into a sword fight with someone. I think he gets into a sword fight with a reporter with the sword of justice. It's just, and that didn't test well with test audiences, so they cut that out and then did a whole new ending. It's just one of those movies where it's hard to really give a shit about what's happening. You don't really have anyone to root for. I mean, even Peter Fallow, who initially you kind of want to root for because he's a guy who's kind of stuck in a rut and is down on his luck, and you want him to find the right path and get that big story and get back on his feet and get sober. But then even he is doing shady stuff and, manipulating the system. So even he's not really the most likable guy. Sherman McCoy, like I said earlier, is a dickhead who's cheating on his wife, and I'm supposed to actually care about this guy. He comes across like a snooty prick, and you don't give a shit about the assistant DA, who's a mouse, who and is just a really irritating character. I don't care about the mistress. I don't give a shit about Sherman's wife at the end of the day, because she's honestly kind of a bitch too. There's no one to root for. There's no one to really care about. So the film just drags narratively because you just don't really have any character to emotionally invest in. The comedy is not funny. It's not really a good comedy either when it comes to the writing, or there's not a lot of witty dialogue or memorable barbs like something like War of the Roses or some of these other movies that are dramas but also dark comedies. The mystery, there's nothing mysterious about it at all because you know what happened from the very beginning. And also, the way that Sherman is able to free himself, the way that he's able to clear his name, is the most random shit possible. He just happened to be in an apartment with his mistress where the apartment owners, the landlords, set up a recording apparatus inside the apartment so they could record some tape to figure out what's going on with this apartment and see who actually is living there. If there is anyone actually living there full time. At least the person that's supposedly subletting it. And that tape just happens to also be in the same room where Sherman and his mistress are talking, and there's a conversation that happens, and it implicates Sherman's mistress. And then Sherman initially is not able to admit that into court as evidence because it wasn't recorded by him, but then he tries to record something, but then it doesn't work out later on. So then he just lies about it, and the judge is like, yeah, sure. Is this the truth? And Sherman's like, yes. And the judge is like, okay, I'll allow it. Case dismissed. And then that's it. That's all this is. That's what all this film is, just that. It just culminates into that. I mean, it's lackluster. It's lazy screenwriting. I find it hard to believe that the story itself was probably this banal and this bland, because it probably wasn't. The novel itself probably had more to it since it was a bestseller. Like, it had to have had more to it. And then you have the cast, which is just a really big spotlight to me on why it's so important to cast based on fit. Not based on star power, not based on bankable stars, based on who fits with the source material the best. Tom Hanks does not fit as a yuppie. He doesn't fit as a guy who's stepping over people in order to make his fortune. He doesn't fit as a guy who is calling himself a master of the universe. He just does not fit as that character. He doesn't fit as a cynical douchebag businessman, Wall Street guy who is cheating on his wife. It just does not fit. And I think they cast him because they switched things around with the narrative, because they were afraid that audiences were going to be unable to relate to or connect to Sherman if he wasn't more sympathetic. And I think that was a mistake, because audiences weren't going to connect with him that much, period, because of the type of person that he is. So it would make more sense to just turn hard into his negative traits. Just make this guy into a total fucking douchebag with a capital D. And that's how it would have worked if they were going to do this. And that's how the novel was. That's why I think in the novel, I think a lot of these characters were like British. They were like British guys. That's why people initially had British actors in mind, possibly for some of these roles. Like Jack Nicholson as Peter Fallow, or John Cleese, because Fallow was, I guess, English in the novel. So initially they were trying to go in that direction, but it just didn't turn out that way. So they went with Tom Hanks because I guess they felt that Tom Hanks would represent the guy who's more sympathetic. And I mean, on paper, it's not bad casting if you're trying to do that, because Tom Hanks is a very likable kind of guy. But the issue is Tom Hanks is not a good enough actor at this point in his career to pull off the more rougher edges of this character. So you just have a very poor performance. It's honestly one of his worst acting performances, if you ask me, because it's just such a bad fit. He's drowning in every scene that he's in, except for a few little sequences when he's frazzled and he's able to tap into the frantic nature that he was well known for at the time, where he's just losing it and he snaps at the party, for instance, or that scene that he shares with Bruce Willis on the subway. That's the kind of stuff that works with Tom Hanks. And I know why Tom did it. He wanted to show that he was a more capable actor when it comes to dramatic work. But this just wasn't the right fit for him. And I know people have said that Bruce Willis was not the right fit as Peter Fallow, but I disagree. I think Bruce Willis was arguably the best actor in the entire production to me. I thought he fit really well with this role of this drunk, down on his luck reporter who is showing up hungover to all these parties. His boss is basically calling him shit, and then he eventually gets this case that falls into his lap, and it brings him back to life, and he just goes even harder into his alcoholism and the darker aspects of his nature by the start of the film, which is taking place after the success of his novel. So the success has gotten to his head, and he's like drinking, and he's just a really lecherous kind of individual. And I think it fit really well for the kind of personality and the kind of inherent charisma and ability that Bruce Willis has. The one thing that I think didn't fit as well was the narration, but I think that's just because I think the script should have featured less narration, because there's a lot of moments where the narration is just not needed, and it's not like Bruce Willis's narration is bad. It's just there's a lot of moments where it just feels like it's tacked on. But Bruce Willis's performance overall, I thought it was good. I liked it. I thought he did a really good job. He's one of those few golden crumbs for me. Melanie Griffith, on the other hand, is Maria. woo. I mean, damn. If she was just in a porn and she was just cast solely for her assets, then it would be a positive. But that's not the case here. She wasn't casted solely due to her sex appeal and her bouncing bosoms. So what we have here is just a really awful performance with a accent that I still can't place. I don't know what the hell it was. And the character just comes across as a irritating bimbo. And I think that was kind of the point, but the performance is never charming at any point in time. So you just want to get Melanie Griffith off your screen because you just can't stand her take on this character. It's not that I can't stand her as a person, I just can't stand her personal take on Maria. Kim Cattrall isn't much better at all as Judy McCoy, Sherman's wife. Very inauthentic performance, almost cartoonish. Not almost cartoonish, very cartoonish. And another instance of an accent that's just unbelievably fake. What kind of British accent is that supposed to be? And it just seemed like these two actresses were competing with one another throughout this entire movie to show who is going to deliver the most inauthentic and most god-awful performance in the entire movie. Like, both of them were just fucking terrible. They were really, really bad. Saul Rubinek wasn't much better as Judd Kramer. It's Jed Kramer, my bad. I'm sorry, I had a bit of a minor sort of brain aneurysm there because I just remembered how just really bad this performance was. This performance is so mousy and so just that the guy might as well have had mouse ears on throughout the entire performance. And like a block of cheese that he would bite into from scene to scene. Morgan Freeman, he was one of the few bright spots other than Bruce Willis in this cast as the judge. This no nonsense, take no shit from anyone judge who had some nice moments, like where he would tell it like it is at the courtroom, not buy into anyone's bullshit. I don't blame Morgan Freeman. The speech at the end was a bit much, but I don't blame Morgan Freeman. I think he still did the best that he possibly could with such material. And I think he definitely had a point when he's talking about how he just wants people to be decent, because this whole courtroom devolves into a circus by the end of the movie. And you have people who are in the audience calling Morgan Freeman racist because he dismissed the case. And you also have some other actors like Kevin Dunn as Tom Killian, this slimy lawyer who is given Sherman's case. You also have Richard Libertini from Fletch. He played Fletch's boss. He's in a bit role as a high school teacher who is a teacher for the kid who got hit by the car. And speaking of like the kid who got hit by a car, that's another problem that I have with this film is like, why should I give a fuck about this mugger? Why should I care that he's in a coma? Why should I give a shit what happens to him? He's also an asshole. And I guess there was a scene that was filmed at the end that shows that he's not even in a coma and that he was just faking it the entire time. And then he walks into the courtroom, or that was in the script, but they didn't film it. And honestly, I wish that scene was in there, because that would have just really further emphasized how ridiculous this movie is. And that might have made it funnier in some way. It wouldn't have made it better, but I would have laughed at that, because I would have been like, oh my god, Like what a clown show. And it would have made the goof where the actor blinks in one scene make a lot more sense. He's supposed to be in a coma, and he clearly blinks on camera. You also have an uncredited F. Murray Abraham who plays the corrupt DA, who's a racist asshole, who is trying to manipulate the voters. I can see why he decided to not be credited for this. This is one of his worst performances. Like, this character was loathsome, and this performance was equally as loathsome to watch. It was just really hammy and just over the top to the point where it just was cringe-inducing. One other actor I want to mention is Alan King, who plays Arthur Ruskin, this just loudmouth, brash, rich guy who's the husband of Maria. I really liked his performance in this. He was fun in the like one or two scenes that he was in. I thought he had some good chemistry with Bruce Willis during the sequence that they were co-starring in. And you also had Kirsten Dunst, who played Campbell McCoy, the daughter of the McCoys, and I think a very early role. I don't think she really had much to say. Oh, and I might as well mention, Donald Moffat, who played Tom Hanks's father, and John Hancock, who played the Reverend Bacon. I didn't care for John Hancock's performance either. It was very, once again, very just cartoonish. I don't know what was up with these cartoonish performances. And when it comes to the social commentary and the comedy, it's laid on so thick, they might as well be dumping cement all over you because it's just so thick and so hard and so concrete. There's other times too where it's so obvious that they might as well have been hitting you in the face with a shovel the entire time. Like, there's this whole scene with John Hancock with the Reverend Bacon, where he's talking to the camera and he's talking about the boy who was hit by a car and is in a coma, and you got singers in the background doing gospel choir songs, and I'm just like, what is this? And there's all this stuff where it's trying to talk about racism and social issues, but then there's a lot of stuff in this that's just flat out fucking racist. And not even in a way where it's like a satire. It's just fucking racist. So it's like one of those things you're like, is this supposed to be a satire? Because it doesn't come across like a satire. It just comes across as, here are a bunch of fucking racists. And you're just like, This is a hard watch. This is a hard film to watch. Not because it's so bad and because it's so poorly put together and it's such a mess, but because of things like that where you were just like, ooh, ugh. You got F. Murray Abraham dropping the N-bomb. You got fucking Reverend Bacon talking about the young black kid who was struck down in his prime, and you got people doing gospel choir in the background. I mean, maybe it was intended to be a satire, but if that's the case, it's just a piss poor satire because there's no subtlety to it. I mean, I should have known better, considering that Geraldo Rivera makes a cameo in this movie. I mean, that guy is like the epitome of a bullshit artist. So it's fitting for a movie that's just full of just so much bullshit. I mean, this is a film that had a cinematographer who, by the way, did a great job shooting a sequence. I think it was a second unit director, actually. There's this entire sequence in the beginning of the film, which is shot, I think, in one take, that follows Peter Fallow around while he's getting ready for his award ceremony. That was a really impressive shot that opened the film. But then there's other stuff where it's just the epitome of useless, unnecessary excess. I'm going to spend millions of dollars shooting a scene of a Concorde landing at night or during a sunset that lasts like 5 seconds. I don't think it was millions of dollars, but it was like hundreds of thousands of dollars. More money than I will probably ever see in my entire life on a shot that you basically could blink and miss. I mean, even the opening credits was excess. Like, they shot this entire, like, time-lapse, like, big, wide aerial shot of New York City that cost them a fortune. And for what? For a film that was just an absolute fucking bomb? And yeah, it's well shot by Vilmos Zsigmond. I'll give him credit. From a technical standpoint, the Bonfire of the Vanities is not something that is a total trash fire. It really isn't. It's a well shot film. It has some nice cinematography, some nice looking shots, very slick, very stylish, very impressive in that regard. Like most of Vilmos Zsigmond's work. I really like the opening shot of a skyscraper with a gargoyle. I thought that was a really cool looking shot. As well as the opening sequence and a few other scenes throughout the movie, like the opera scene and the sequence when Maria and Sherman are driving their BMW through the burned out, rundown parts of the city. The editing was fine by Bill Pankow and David Ray. The music, though, by Dave Grusin was a gruesome fit. I really like Dave Grusin. He's a really underrated, great composer. He did one of my favorite scores with the score for The Goonies. But when you hear notes of The Goonies in a film like this, that's not a good sign. This score was just schmaltzy. It was just really just not a good score for this kind of film. It almost felt like something you'd hear in a sitcom. Like, it was just a really lame score from a genuinely talented composer. And it just makes me think, like, what was the whole plan here? Did they even, like, consult with Dave when it comes to what kind of film they're trying to make? Did they just let him just do whatever? Like, I just don't get it. Like, it's a score that sounds like it should be in a film that has a much lighter tone. This is not a movie that has a very light tone. There's a lot of heavy social commentary and just the insanity of society in general and capitalism and and a lot of these other things. And you have this very happy-go-lucky kind of score, and it just does not work. It's another ingredient that just makes this entire golden cake taste bad. And then you have the icing on the cake, the running time, which is 126 minutes, and it drags so fucking much because there's no investment in the story. There's no investment in these characters. You're not really that entertained that much by it. It's like being strapped to a seat and you're forced to watch a bad movie, and it's not so bad to the point where you're like, ha ha, that's hilarious. That's look at those incompetent special effects. Or, man, that acting is so abysmally bad, it's hilarious. Or, what the hell are they doing with this plot? No, it's just one of those films where, like, this is just boring. This is dull. I don't care. I don't care about these rich people's problems. Why the fuck should I care? And then you're just wandering around mentally. You're like, okay, what is this? Why are we doing this? And where is this going? And then once it goes to the place that it's going to, you're like, that's it? And then when it's over, you're like, thank God, I don't have to sit through this anymore. Anyway, I really don't know what else to say about the Bonfire of the Vanities, except thanks for watching my review, and as always, I'll see you later. See ya.